It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to you lot in Brighton again. So I'm coming from Nottingham here. But before we start, why is that not? I'm just trying to move back. Hang on a minute. Oh, there we go. Good. Okay. So before we start, I'll just introduce myself. I've been in design for a long time now, and I know some of you are probably thinking of going into fashion design or textile design or something in the creative arts. And I just wanted to say that, you know, it's not always, you don't always have to decide what you're going to do right now, because I always wanted to be a designer, but I didn't know how or why or where or what way. And throughout my life, I've really gone through a number of different things. I've had experience in a number of different things, which all sort of interconnect in some ways. And I think that if you've got, you know, if you've got the passion to keep going, even when the times are hard, you'll get there in the end in some way, shape or form. And I've gone through experiences with theatre design, Savile Row tailoring, period costume design for the BBC, then pattern cutting, and now I'm doing more research into pattern cutting and sculptural forms. I'm also a knitwear designer, but I'm just recently, I've become much more interested in sustainability. And as an educator, I've been collaborating with different universities to develop different ways of teaching to bring in sustainability. And one of our lectures in this series is about sustainable design. So we'll come back to that. But I just wanted to just give you a bit of a flavour of where I'm coming from, and I felt that I never really decided what I wanted to be, whether I wanted to be a fashion designer or a costume designer. And I think really where I fit is somewhere in between the two. I'm not really fashion and I'm not really costume, so it's quite interesting to think that I don't think you need to pigeonhole yourself anymore. Anyway, to get on with today's lecture, it's about counterculture. And we have some handouts as well, actually, and some questions to ask at the end if we've got time to ask some questions and discuss what you think. If anything comes to mind, make some quick notes as you're listening, and maybe we can discuss some things at the end. So I'll just start by reading this quote. The whole room is packed with people who are about to become famous, if only for 15 minutes. So what is counterculture and what is subculture? What are the differences? The dictionary says subcultures are segments of a larger culture. Counterculture is the opposition to the dominant culture, and material culture is physical objects, resources, spaces and people. So what makes culture dominant? Political, social and economic entity. So basically, life expectations and experiences frame our perspectives, building awareness. We need to put it in context. So what films are you drawn to? Shows, exhibitions, emerging themes. As a designer, you'll all gravitate towards different things and different things that inspire you. And that will make a complete difference to your personality and to the way you work and to your own designs. So I'd like to share my experiences of counterculture in the 70s and 80s. So we'll go back. I mean, I think this, you know, I've spent a life in design in some way or another, and this is where it started for me. So it was when Lady Di married Prince Charles, before you lot were born, probably, of course. And Margaret Thatcher became the Prime Minister. A time of emerging dissatisfaction, miners' strikes, punk rock, and a widening gap between the rich and the poor. So a good example of when you think you have to put things in context is this. This is an image of Vivienne Westwood, well-known image in 1977. It's Vivienne Westwood wearing a swastika t-shirt. Now, to look at that 50 years down the line, you might think that she supported Hitler by the look of her t-shirt. but it was quite the opposite. It was a statement against Hitler and against any other authority. It was about standing up to horrific dictators around the world. It was a means of challenging older generation. The T-shirt, emblazoned with the bold red Nazi swastika and inverted image of Christ on the cross, the word destroy, and Sex Pistol lyrics, was undoubtedly one of her most controversial designs. But to see, just to think you have to put things in context, because what her wearing that in the 70s means so much more, means something totally different to somebody possibly wearing it today. In 2013, the V&A Museum celebrated the 80s with the exhibition Club to Catwalk. It defined the spirit of this period, showing influences of clubwear on the catwalk and in film. This exhibition certainly started a new flurry of interest in the London club scene of the 80s. But really, I think you could probably find some of these characters, or some of very similar characters, back in the day following the Second World War, in the jazz bars and the saloon clubs of inner London. In London Calling, which is a book published, a book by Barry Miles, he talks about people who make art their life and who live in counterculture, the avant-garde, the bohemian. And to quote from his book, underground life is any city, underground life of any city is shaped not just because the social, not by, sorry, it's shaped not just by the social and political situation, but also built environment, the availability of cheap accommodation, the provision of cafes, bars and meeting places, galleries and performance spaces. So it's not just about people. It needs to be a place for them to come together, and it needs to be something that's cheap and available, and something that's that people can have access to. The exhibition was set up like a club scene upstairs. There were films and music on display by Geoffrey Hinton, the DJ. And it took you back to a time before AIDS. And AIDS really did change the club scene when AIDS came out in the 80s. And before that, everyone kissed on meeting. And the AIDS scene, and when AIDS came out, it certainly changed that whole way of being in the club scene. Here you can see, and the exhibition did actually mention that it did sort of bring in the sort of the highs and the lows of the 80s. You can see a diverse range of characters here and designers. And so from left to right, you've got Lee Bowery, a performance artist. Then you've got Vivienne Westwood. And then you've got Kinky Galinki's Gerlinda. Then you at the right-hand side there, you've got David Holer and Stevie Stewart's the body map designers on the right. And right in the centre there in red is Call Me Madam, Dresses for Men, which was actually one of mine. In fact, two red dresses right in the middle, one behind the other. And then the London's Calling exhibition at Bonington Gallery in Nottingham in 2017. This was at Trent University, Nottingham Trent University. This captured my personal 80s club art and fashion scene with original archive images, leaflets, flyers and artifacts. These were presented in glass boxes, and original film footage was on the walls. Oh, sorry. Putting in context here. So I grew up in the mid-70s in a small village in the Midlands, and then went to Loughborough Art College. During this time, the punk movement was really hitting off in London. And although there were punk bands in the Midlands and up north, London was really where it was happening, and I was desperate to go there. Remember, there were no mobile phones, no internet, and we caught up with the news on TV and read newspapers in those early days. Top of the Pops and ID magazine were our internet, and punk rock was a very new thing, completely different to what had gone before. Really different. You can't imagine how shocking it was in those times, straight after the 70s. Newspapers reported of young people spitting in the street, dyeing their hair and wearing safety pins. They were portrayed as violent, but most of them were between 15 and 20 years old. It was a movement for the young. Punks were against authority, and the new energy of the music was fantastic. Previous to this, in the early 70s, we'd had glam rock with Sweet, the bands Sweet and Slade, but these were still hanging on to the 60s influences with feather boas and sparkly eyeshadow and so on. There was always reggae music and Tamla Motown classics, which was great, and that carried right through. But then suddenly we had Mark Bolan and David Bowie, and these crossed boundaries in music and gender politics. We also had influences from the Rocky Horror Show in 1975, a great influence in pushing boundaries of the expected norm. Inspirational characters that seemed glamorous to us. For some young people, this gave the opportunity to dress up and fit in somewhere else, an identity that didn't fit in with the norm. I arrived in London late 70s, in the late 1970s, about 18 years old, fresh from Loughborough College of Art. It was easy to get a council flat then. Really, everything was cheaper. You didn't really seem to need money to do things in those days. And I don't know, I think other people have said the same, so it's not just me being nostalgic. I made sure I went to the right places and met the people I wanted to meet. In fact, I hitchhiked to London from Loughborough. And I think I had about £3 in my pocket at the time. So it's something you could not do now. You could not do that today. I found myself in Islington, and there was a very well-known famous pub there called the Hope and Anchor. It had a refreshing mix of tribes. It was almost like I'd found my family. You walked into this pub and there were, you know, this is the late 70s, early 80s. There were punks, art school kids, blitz kids, rastas, mods, rude boys, skinheads, every different type of tribe, all mixing together. And it was amazing. And it was just, you can't imagine how good that was from a time before that, where a woman probably wouldn't be able to go into a pub on her own, really, without having to take a newspaper with her or a magazine or a book or something and sit very quietly in the corner reading. It was sort of frowned upon women going in pubs on their own. And here, this pub was something else. It was like a club of people who everybody was accepted. It was just amazing. I can't explain how good it was to suddenly find that there was this sort of thing that you could exist in a different way, to being that, to being that sort of 70s lady who had to dance around her handbag and be asked out to dance and all of that business. It was such a change, such a shock, and such a real change for young people. They weren't going to do that anymore. They wanted their own way of living. There was a tiny stage in the basement, and everyone played there, from Ian Jury to Madness to Selector. At 19B, at 19B Thornhill Road, my flat, it became the place to meet people. Many people arrived to get ready to go out and came back to crash often. There was one large room, which was my studio. We crammed 3 or 4 industrial sewing machines in there, an industrial steamer, an industrial overlocker, all into that room. The walls were covered in photographs. There were wet rails full of clothing. This place was certainly a hub of constant activity. By the mid-80s, many punks had progressed to more theatrical dressing up. And our identities were in part formed through our association with each other, featuring nightclub personalities, Lee Bowery and Sue Tilley, David Holer and Stevie Stewart of Body Map, Princess Juliana, Tasty Tim, Pinky Tessa, George O'Dowd, Maria Malapasta, urban artist Stephen Willits of Inside the Night, Andrew Logan of The Alternative Miss World, Brian Clark, glass artist Dougie Fields and Luciana Martinez de la Rosa, Mr. Holly Johnson, stylist Judy Blame, Divine, Molly Parkins and Sophie Parkin, Billy Idol, Annie Lennox, John Galliano, Jean-Paul Gaultier and the lovely Lee McQueen, to name a few. This scene offered freedom for self-expression, to be who you wanted to be, away from sexism and homophobia and racism. It gave working class kids opportunity to break the expected mold, a large family of misfits. The clubs were our life.
Hi.
The alternative set, frequently now referred to as the 80s club kids or the Blitz kids. When I first met Lee Bowery, I was wearing a long silver lame dress with diamante necklace and tiara and a long evening gloves. The large diamante necklace had been given to me by an elderly drag artist from Soho, and I felt I was pure Hollywood glamour. Unknown to me, Lee Bowery at the time was unknown to me. He just walked straight up to me, lifted me up in the air above his head, and he was tall, over 6 foot tall, and twirled me around like an aeroplane for about 20 minutes. Then he put me down and walked off. This was what you might call was a happening, an art happening. And you might find, if you research art happenings, in the 70s, a lot of this sort of thing happened with fine art students. People would just do things out of spontaneously and call it a happening. And I felt so proud to have been part of a happening. And later, of course, we became friends. But that was my first introduction to Lee Bowery, who is actually really now very well known as a performance artist. Cha-Chas, this was a club within heaven, a club within a club, run by my good friends Scarlett and Maria Malapasta. This is an image from the book Cha-Chas by Stephen Willits. Stephen would photograph us all and make art pieces and sculptures depicting our life stories and our lifestyles. Everyone knew each other, a party of friends. We never paid to get into any club. It would have been insulting. Nobody had any money, and we positively shunned high fashion brands. We made our own clothes. We went out to have a good time and felt safe within the club setting. It was underground. You had to be part of that crowd or invited in. There were no selfies, no digital mobile phones, no Instagram. We did get drunk and we did kiss everyone, and we smudged our makeup and ripped our clothes, lost our brooches and lost things, but had a great night laughing with good friends. Photos were taken of us, but there wasn't that intensity of always having to look perfect. We didn't for any minute think, what are we going to look like on Instagram or on Facebook the next day? That just didn't even enter our heads. An esoteric extravaganza. This was a series of fashion shows organised by the management of Heaven Club in London and the Danceteria in New York, which is another club. Fashion shows included myself, John Galliano and Judy Blame, and all our friends modelled for us in London and in New York. Models needed to have attitude. This was far more important than good looks. We did a deal with Virgin Atlantic. Richard Branson provided the flights in exchange for us providing a fashion show on the plane. This was well before health and safety kicked in. Everyone was drinking, people were smoking heavily. And of course, New York was a very exciting place. Steam was coming from the streets in Manhattan. Graffiti was there throughout the subway and underground, subway underground. Dangerous places, which of course we went to. It's the home of Studio 54 and the New York nightlife of the 70s and 80s, which is famous for disco, punk and new wave. Grace Jones, Andy Warhol, Keith Haring and Basquiat. It was a very exciting time in the late 70s, early 80s in New York. And I think we were inspired by them and they were inspired by us. The rise of popular drag and the Call Me Madam label. There was no conscious decision to design dresses for men. A friend once asked me to design a dress for him. Soon, other friends asked. They wanted something to wear for a night out. Male, female, straight, gay. Androgyny wasn't a word we knew then. This was experimentation and acceptance. A role, an image, not an identity as such. Image versus identity. To conjure an image is to create a world, albeit transient. How to change a world. After the demise of radical drag must come the rise of popular drag. But not inevitably. Cross-dressing as a political statement is not new. Yet it remains a political statement. Perhaps a degree of acceptance now exists, but acceptance also implies existence of dissension. It's interesting now that we think it has become mainstream, boys dressing in dresses. We've got the RuPaul, obviously, and we now have and even just, but yeah, we have RuPaul, which is extremely mainstream. But I think if I think back to those days, it was even people that were gay had to hide the fact they were gay. So we've come such a long way since then. So never mind dressing in a dress. It was, you know, I even got stopped in the street because I had a green fringe by the policeman. By the police stopped me in the street for having a green fringe. So you can, honestly, it really has, you can't imagine how much it has come on since those days in lots of ways. The alternative Miss World. I was introduced to Andrew Logan, who has been putting on alternative Miss World since the days of his art school in the early 70s. So he's now in his 70s and still putting on alternative Miss Worlds. I was invited to make a dress for a contestant, and then ended up making costumes for the scintillating secretary and all the onstage dancers. Andrew Logan and his friends were older than us and opened up a whole new set of friends within the arts. Stephen Willits, who I've mentioned before, is an artist concerned with political issues around identity and urban environment. He gave me the opportunity to work on a piece with him about my lifestyle, living like a Goya. This was exhibited at the Riverside Studios in London in 1984 and was featured in many magazines, including Art Review. We did have these opportunities to collaborate with artists and designers. It seemed to be that everyone helped each other. So You know, you might do some work for somebody, you might work for a friend and then they pay you in jewelry, or you might model for a friend and they give you a top, or, you know, everybody sort of helped each other and paid with their work. So it was a very creative time and a great way of working. So people didn't really need the money then either, probably too. I think that's probably part of it. Within this set, obviously, within this set of people. But this is an alternative set of people, remember. So we made friends for life because we were growing up together. You know, I think most of us, I had friends from, you know, 16 years old. And I think I remember someone saying they were 24, and I thought that was really old. Although, you know, we did mix, there were lots of older people, like really older people in the 70s and so on, that were extreme and like sort of eccentrics. But the majority of us were sort of in our 20s, I'd say, and well, from 16 to 20 something. We made friends for life growing up together. We pushed boundaries at a time of extremes. We shared a lot of highs and we shared a lot of lows. At the time when the onslaught of AIDS brought us weekly funerals, we lost a lot of people as well. We wanted to escape suburbia, get away from what was expected of us. I was expected to be a secretary, except that I couldn't spell. And there were no computers in those days and no spell check. I couldn't type. But that was the only thing that my mother thought that I should do. And I suppose that was what it was expected of her. So in this space, we became whoever we wanted to be. It's interesting then to look further back to a time of cabarets, cafes and jazz clubs in the 20s and 30s, and to understand how these creative spaces in which artists, performers, designers and musicians congregated to push boundaries and artistic expression. Many club kids from the 80s took inspiration from films such as Cabaret. They were mesmerized by the glamour of old Hollywood movies and the dressing up of Ziegfeld Follies, for example. It was an attitude of mind that comes to each generation. So, what becomes of fashion? What is behind fashion's fascination with club culture? Club culture is big news in fashion right now, but is there more to the trend than nostalgia? Like any tight-knit industry, fashion has a language. Fashion people seem to have a flamboyant expression of sensibility with catchphrases like working it, major, I'm dying, feeling. As in, I'm not really feeling those shoes. Can you try the other ones? Or I'm sort of feeling chintz florals right now. Feeling isn't unique to the fashion world, of course, but feeling is a particularly apt word. The word feeling is used to describe that tingly sensation that something is in the air, that there's a trend about to happen. For the past year or so, I've been feeling the club culture, not the present day club scene, but the influence of the old club scenes. The thing about these clubs was that you couldn't get into them unless you looked right or amazing. Basically, you had to look different. And this doesn't mean an expensive fashion look or off the peg, head to head in labels from a store. It cost you a fortune. That didn't matter. What mattered was that you brought your own individuality to the place and that you were wearing something that was individual, had character, and it didn't matter whether you were in a bin bag, but that was more preferable than being in head to toe in labels. of course, you had to have the attitude to wear these things too. The most outrageous, the better. A doorman would hold a mirror up to a stranger and ask, would you let you in? Because I wouldn't. And of course, this wouldn't happen today. Today you can go to a club, but money talks. It's all about money now. It's a totally different way of working it now. Clubland. The club was a place where all different tribes and creative types came together. Have these tribal fashion identities been subsumed, absorbed into fashion mainstream? Do we now live in the age of the international, as the age of the international hipster, in which street style in which street style trends go global in an instant and mainstream in a flash? The hardest thing today is to be underground. And I'm wondering whether you have, it'd be interesting to have a conversation now about your thoughts on this, and about whether, you know, if we could look at some of the questions and talk about whether you think that there is a certain type of person that's drawn to these tribes, or whether it's inherent in you, whether it's part of your art and part of your being, or whether it's something that's manufactured. So I'm just going to stop sharing for a minute and see what you have, if anybody has anything good to say.